The smell reached the crowd long before the prisoner did. Iron, smoke, wet wood, and the thick, greasy scent of burning fat drifting across London's Smithfield Market. It was August, 1305. Morning light pushed weakly through a ceiling of gray cloud. Thousands of people packed the square shoulder to shoulder. Merchants abandoned their stalls. Priests stood beside beggars. Noblemen leaned from balconies. Children sat on rooftops. They were not gathered for a hanging. Hangings were ordinary, predictable, almost boring. They came because the most powerful king in Western Europe had promised them something unforgettable. King Edward I of England did not simply execute enemies, he designed messages. And today's message had one target: William Wallace, a man without a crown, without a castle, without noble blood, a man the system insisted should never have mattered. And yet the king had spent 7 years hunting him. 7 years pouring gold into spies, soldiers, traitors, informants. 7 years rewriting laws and reshaping courts just to guarantee this moment would happen exactly as planned. Because Wallace was not dangerous in the usual way. He did not threaten England with wealth. He did not threaten it with armies. He threatened something far more fragile: belief. The medieval world rested on a simple, brutal idea. God chose kings. Kings chose nobles. Nobles controlled land, and everyone else obeyed. The chain was supposed to be unbreakable, but Wallace had broken it. He skipped the nobles entirely. He walked past castles and banners and coats of arms. He went straight to the farmers, the blacksmiths, the laborers, the starving, and he turned them into an army. Not a professional army, not a trained army. An army of men holding farming tools and sharpened wood. And that army did the impossible. It dragged English knights from their horses and killed them in the mud. To the King of England, this was not rebellion. This was infection. Because if one ordinary man could inspire peasants to defeat knights, then the entire structure of medieval power could collapse. Edward understood symbols better than any ruler of his age. He knew a quiet death would turn Wallace into a martyr. A battlefield death would turn him into a hero. So Wallace would receive something else, something unforgettable, something that would burn itself into memory so deeply that future rebels would feel fear before courage ever had a chance to rise. Today was not about killing a man. Today was about destroying an idea. The square roared as soldiers forced a path through the crowd. Iron scraped against wood. Chains clinked with every step. The prisoner was coming. But to understand why this execution mattered, you have to go back 9 years, to a Scotland that no longer existed. England did not invade Scotland the way kingdoms usually invaded each other. There was no single catastrophic battle, no dramatic final stand, no heroic last defense. Instead, Edward dismantled Scotland piece by piece. He forced its king to surrender. He stripped him of his crown, his symbols, his dignity. He seized the stone of destiny, the ancient slab used to crown Scottish kings, and dragged it south as a trophy. Then he turned to the nobles. Edward understood wealthy men perfectly. You did not need to destroy them. You only needed to frighten them. He offered them a simple equation: submit and keep your land. Submit and keep your titles. Submit and keep your heads. Resist and watch your family erased. They signed, hundreds of them, their names inked onto a massive document of submission known as the Ragman Rolls. In a single stroke, Scotland's ruling class surrendered their country to save themselves. The system worked exactly as designed. England controlled the nobles controlled the land controlled the people. Rebellion should have been impossible, but systems built on fear share one fatal weakness: they only work on people who still have something to lose. In the spring of 1297, a quiet spark ignited in a small... The smell reached the crowd long before the prisoner did. Iron, smoke, wet wood, and the thick, greasy scent of burning fat drifting across London's Smithfield Market. It was August, 1305. Morning light pushed weakly through a ceiling of gray cloud. Thousands of people packed the square shoulder to shoulder. Merchants abandoned their stalls. Priests stood beside beggars. Noblemen leaned from balconies. Children sat on rooftops. They were not gathered for a hanging. Hangings were ordinary, predictable, almost boring. They came because the most powerful king in Western Europe had promised them something unforgettable. King Edward I of England did not simply execute enemies, he designed messages. And today's message had one target: William Wallace, a man without a crown, without a castle, without noble blood, a man the system insisted should never have mattered. And yet the king had spent 7 years hunting him. 7 years pouring gold into spies, soldiers, traitors, informants. 7 years rewriting laws and reshaping courts just to guarantee this moment would happen exactly as planned. Because Wallace was not dangerous in the usual way. He did not threaten England with wealth. He did not threaten it with armies. He threatened something far more fragile: belief. The medieval world rested on a simple, brutal idea. God chose kings. Kings chose nobles. Nobles controlled land, and everyone else obeyed. The chain was supposed to be unbreakable, but Wallace had broken it. He skipped the nobles entirely. He walked past castles and banners and coats of arms. He went straight to the farmers, the blacksmiths, the laborers, the starving, and he turned them into an army. Not a professional army, not a trained army. An army of men holding farming tools and sharpened wood. And that army did the impossible. It dragged English knights from their horses and killed them in the mud. To the King of England, this was not rebellion. This was infection. Because if one ordinary man could inspire peasants to defeat knights, then the entire structure of medieval power could collapse. Edward understood symbols better than any ruler of his age. He knew a quiet death would turn Wallace into a martyr. A battlefield death would turn him into a hero. So Wallace would receive something else, something unforgettable, something that would burn itself into memory so deeply that future rebels would feel fear before courage ever had a chance to rise. Today was not about killing a man. Today was about destroying an idea. The square roared as soldiers forced a path through the crowd. Iron scraped against wood. Chains clinked with every step. The prisoner was coming. But to understand why this execution mattered, you have to go back 9 years, to a Scotland that no longer existed. England did not invade Scotland the way kingdoms usually invaded each other. There was no single catastrophic battle, no dramatic final stand, no heroic last defense. Instead, Edward dismantled Scotland piece by piece. He forced its king to surrender. He stripped him of his crown, his symbols, his dignity. He seized the stone of destiny, the ancient slab used to crown Scottish kings, and dragged it south as a trophy. Then he turned to the nobles. Edward understood wealthy men perfectly. You did not need to destroy them. You only needed to frighten them. He offered them a simple equation: submit and keep your land. Submit and keep your titles. Submit and keep your heads. Resist and watch your family erased. They signed, hundreds of them, their names inked onto a massive document of submission known as the Ragman Rolls. In a single stroke, Scotland's ruling class surrendered their country to save themselves. The system worked exactly as designed. England controlled the nobles controlled the land controlled the people. Rebellion should have been impossible, but systems built on fear share one fatal weakness. They only work on people who still have something to lose. In the spring of 1297, a quiet spark ignited in a small Scottish town called Lanark. The English sheriff who governed the town ruled through humiliation and taxation. To him, the locals were livestock, resources to be drained. One night, a small group of armed men broke into his home. They dragged him into the street, and they killed him in front of the town. It was not a duel, it was not a battle, it was a message. And the man leading the group was William Wallace. The killing spread through Scotland like wildfire. Stories traveled faster than soldiers. A man had struck back. A man had killed the king's representative. Farmers abandoned their fields. Laborers left workshops. Hungry men disappeared into forests and hills. Wallace stopped being a fugitive. He became a symbol. English commanders dismissed the uprising at first. Peasants with sticks were not a threat. Professional soldiers would crush them easily. So the English assembled a force and marched north to end the rebellion quickly. They chose a crossing point over the River Forth, a narrow wooden bridge near Stirling. On the far side waited Wallace and his army. From the English perspective, the outcome was obvious. Knights in armor, longbowmen, professional infantry against farmers with spears. But Wallace was not fighting the battle the English expected. He was rewriting the rules. He watched as English soldiers began crossing the narrow bridge 2 by 2, slowly, patiently, waiting, counting. He waited until the front of the English army had crossed. He waited until the middle of the English army filled the bridge. He waited until retreat became impossible. Then he attacked. The Scottish army surged downhill in a screaming wave of wood and steel. The English knights could not maneuver. Their horses sank into wet ground. Their formation collapsed into chaos. The narrow bridge became a trap. Men shoved forward. Men tried to retreat. Bodies collided. Horses screamed. Armor dragged soldiers into the river. Hundreds drowned beneath the weight of their own equipment. The impossible had happened. Peasants had destroyed knights. And in that moment, far away in London, King Edward understood something terrifying. This was no longer a rebellion. It was proof that the world could change. And William Wallace had to die. Slowly, publicly, and in a way no one would ever forget. The victory at Stirling Bridge did not create peace. It created momentum, and momentum is far more dangerous than victory, because victory can be explained away. It can be dismissed as luck, a mistake, a fluke of terrain and timing. But momentum spreads, it multiplies, it infects minds faster than armies can march. Across Scotland, the story moved faster than any messenger on horseback. Farmers whispered it in fields. Blacksmiths passed it between hammer strikes. Mothers told it in low voices while children slept beside the fire. The English could bleed. The English could drown. The English could lose. And once an idea like that enters the bloodstream of a nation, it becomes impossible to kill. Men began to move. Not soldiers, not knights, not trained warriors. Men with calloused hands and empty stomachs. Men who had never held a sword before the war arrived at their doorstep. Men who owned nothing worth protecting except the fragile hope that life might be different. They left their homes without ceremony. No grand speeches, no banners, no drums, just quiet departures before sunrise. A tool taken from the wall, a kiss placed on a sleeping child's forehead, a door closed without knowing if it would ever open again. They walked north and west and into the hills. They walked toward a man they had never met. William Wallace did not build an army the way kings built armies. He did not issue royal decrees. He did not promise land or titles or gold. He offered something far more powerful, a chance to fight back. And that was enough. The Scottish resistance began to take shape in the forests and valleys beyond English control. Camps hidden beneath thick canopies. Fires burned low to avoid distant detection. Sentinels posted along narrow paths and ridge lines. This was not a kingdom's army. It was a people's army. And it looked nothing like the armies England understood. There were no polished ranks, no shining armor, no uniform banners snapping in the wind. The men arrived wearing wool and leather and whatever scraps they could carry. Some brought axes meant for wood. Some carried scythes reshaped into weapons. Others gripped long spears carved from young trees. Improvised, uneven, unprofessional, and completely unpredictable. Wallace understood something the English war machine could not comprehend. Discipline does not only grow from training, it can grow from desperation. Every man in those camps knew exactly what would happen if they lost. They had seen the burned villages, the emptied farms, the taxes that stripped families down to hunger, the soldiers who took whatever they wanted and left nothing behind. They were not fighting for glory. They were fighting because there was nowhere left to retreat. And that kind of motivation cannot be drilled into existence. It can only be born. Training began immediately. Not the elegant swordplay of noble courts, not the ritualized combat of knightly tournaments. Wallace trained them for survival, for speed, for shock, for ambush. He taught them to move silently through woodland paths, to strike supply lines instead of strongholds, to vanish before reinforcements could arrive, to fight on ground that favored their feet instead of enemy horses. This was war stripped to its most brutal essentials: food, movement, surprise, fear. English garrisons across Scotland began reporting strange patterns. Supply caravans disappearing between towns. Messengers found dead beside empty roads. Small outposts attacked in the night and abandoned before dawn. No battlefield, no formation, no declaration of war, just sudden violence, and then silence. The English commanders grew frustrated, then angry, then afraid. They were trained to defeat armies, to face banners and horns and marching columns. They were trained for confrontation. They were not trained to fight ghosts. Winter arrived early that year. Cold rain turned roads into mud. Rivers swelled and flooded crossings. Travel slowed to a crawl. And the Scottish resistance adapted faster than the occupying force ever could. Because the resistance lived there. They knew every path, every valley, every narrow pass where a column could be trapped and broken. They moved across the land like it was an extension of their own bodies. The English moved like visitors who had overstayed their welcome. Raids intensified. Small English patrols vanished entirely. Watchtowers burned against the night sky. Fortified towns woke to find their gates destroyed and their storehouses empty. Horses cut loose, weapons stolen, supplies gone. The goal was never occupation. The goal was exhaustion. Every attack forced England to send more troops, more food, more money, more attention, and every shipment had to travel farther into hostile territory than the last. War is expensive. Occupation is more expensive. Endless occupation becomes unbearable. And Wallace knew time was not England's ally. By early 1298, the rebellion had spread far beyond its original spark. Entire regions operated outside English authority. Royal officials traveled only with heavy escort. Tax collection collapsed in multiple counties. For the first time, Edward faced a terrifying possibility. Scotland might not be pacified. It might be slipping away. Edward did not panic. Kings like Edward do not panic. They calculate. And the calculation he made was simple. This was no longer a rebellion. This was a war. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Orders were dispatched across England and Wales. Knights summoned from their estates. Archers recruited from towns and villages. Infantry assembled from every region loyal to the crown. This would not be a garrison response. This would be a campaign. Edward intended to march north himself. But the English king understood something else as well. Stirling had taught him a painful lesson. He would not underestimate William Wallace again. While the English war machine gathered strength, Wallace faced a different challenge. Building an army is easier than sustaining one. Food ran thin, supplies dwindled, weapons broke faster than they could be replaced. Men who had lived as farmers now lived as soldiers, and the land could no longer support both roles at once. War demands sacrifice. Long war demands suffering. Morale became a fragile thing. Some men left quietly in the night, returning to families who needed them more than the rebellion did. Others stayed, but questioned how long resistance could truly last against the wealth of an empire. Wallace understood the danger. Victory at Stirling had proven resistance was possible. But without another victory, doubt would begin to spread. And doubt is a poison no army survives for long. So Wallace made a decision that would change the course of the war. He would take the fight south. Raiding England itself was not just a military action, it was psychological warfare. For years, English soldiers had marched north, believing Scotland was the battlefield and England was the sanctuary. Wallace intended to shatter that illusion. Scottish forces crossed the border in fast-moving columns. Villages in northern England woke to the same terror Scottish villages had known for years. Fires in the distance, hoofbeats in the night, the sudden realization that safety had vanished. The message was unmistakable. This war did not belong to Scotland alone anymore. It had crossed the border. Panic spread through northern English towns. Refugees flooded southward with stories of raids and burning farms. Royal officials scrambled to restore order. The Crown's promise of security suddenly looked fragile, and fragile authority invites dangerous questions. If the king cannot protect his own land, what else might he fail to protect? Edward's patience ended.
The rebellion had grown too bold,
Too visible, too successful. The time for containment was over. The time for annihilation had begun. The English army marched north in force, and this time they were not coming to restore order. They were coming to end the rebellion forever. The English king could no longer ignore the rebellion. Reports flooded London, castles burned, garrisons wiped out, royal officials murdered. A Scottish army was not just resisting, it was winning. King Edward I was not a careless ruler. He was feared across Europe. He had conquered Wales. He had crushed rebellions before. And now he turned his full attention north. He was old, but he was not weak, and he took the uprising personally. Edward believed Scotland belonged to him, not as an ally, not as a neighbor, as property. To him, William Wallace was not a hero. He was a criminal, a bandit, a problem that needed to disappear. The king ordered a full invasion. This was no longer a border conflict. This was war. England did not fight like scattered rebels. England fought with structure, with logistics, with professional armies, thousands of infantry, hundreds of knights in full armor, archers trained since childhood, supply lines stretching miles. This was the most powerful military force in the British Isles, and it was marching toward Scotland. Villages heard the news before they saw the banners. Stories traveled faster than soldiers. The English army was coming, and this time, they were ready. Fear spread across Scotland. Many nobles began to panic. They had supported the rebellion when victory felt possible, but now, the king himself was coming. Some began to reconsider their loyalty, because rebellion is exciting until the empire arrives. Wallace knew the invasion was inevitable. Victory at Stirling Bridge had made him famous, but it had also painted a target on his back. He understood something most leaders refused to admit. The English army could crush Scotland in open battle. They had better armor, better weapons, more soldiers, more money. So Wallace refused to fight the way England wanted. Instead, he changed the rules again. Scotland began to burn its own land, crops destroyed, food hidden, villages abandoned. If the English army marched north, they would find nothing to eat, no supplies, no shelter, no easy victory. It was brutal, it was painful, it was effective. This strategy had a name: scorched earth, and it turned Scotland into a trap. Edward marched anyway. The king did not believe rebels could outlast him. He believed discipline would win. It always had. But the deeper the army moved into Scotland, the harder survival became. Food ran out, horses weakened, supply lines stretched thin. Scottish forces never faced them directly. They attacked at night. They struck isolated units. They disappeared into hills and forests. It was not a war of battles. It was a war of exhaustion. English soldiers began to feel hunted, and nothing terrifies an army more than an enemy they cannot see. Still, Edward pushed forward. Because kings cannot turn back, retreat looks like weakness, and weakness invites rebellion. So the king prepared a final confrontation. He wanted one decisive battle, one crushing victory, one moment that would end the uprising forever. And this time, he would not underestimate the Scots. The armies moved toward Falkirk. The rebels could not avoid this fight forever, not against the full force of England. Wallace gathered his army, farmers, warriors, volunteers ready to die for freedom. They stood in circles of spears, schiltrons, human fortresses built to stop cavalry. They had courage, they had determination, but this time, England had learned. The English archers stepped forward, longbows drawn, rows of disciplined killers trained for years. Wallace had no archers to answer them. The sky darkened, arrows fell like rain. Spearmen held formation as long as they could, but arrows do not care about bravery. Men fell, lines weakened, formations broke. Then the cavalry charged. Steel against flesh, armor against farmers, experience against desperation. The battle was not a fight, it was a collapse. Scotland was losing. And then something worse happened. Scottish nobles fled the battlefield. The men who had sworn loyalty, the leaders who promised support, they rode away to save themselves. They abandoned Wallace. The army collapsed completely. Thousands died. The rebellion shattered in a single day. The Battle of Falkirk was over, and England had won. But they did not capture Wallace. He vanished again, wounded, defeated, betrayed, but still alive. And the war was not finished. Because defeat does not kill a legend. Sometimes it creates one. After Falkirk, England believed the rebellion was finished. The Scottish army was broken. The nobles had abandoned the fight. The battlefield belonged to the crown. But they still had not captured the man who started it all. William Wallace had disappeared again. And this time, he stopped trying to win wars. He decided to win something far more powerful: fear. Wallace understood a brutal truth. He could not defeat England in open battle. Not anymore. Not after Falkirk. So he returned to the shadows. Small groups, night attacks, ambushes, disappearing before sunrise. There would be no more grand victories, only constant danger. And danger is exhausting. English garrisons began to change their behavior. Soldiers stopped traveling alone. Messengers refused to ride at night. Supply wagons demanded heavy escorts, because anywhere, at any moment, Wallace could appear. This was not traditional warfare. This was psychological warfare, and it worked. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some said Wallace never slept. Some said he could move through forests without leaving tracks. Some claimed he had spies in every town. Stories grow in the dark, and soldiers believed them, because fear does not need proof. English commanders began making mistakes. They overreacted. They punished villages suspected of helping rebels. They executed innocent people as warnings. They believed cruelty would stop the rebellion. Instead, it fed it. Every burned home created new enemies. Every execution created new rebels. England was winning battles, but losing control. Meanwhile, Scotland suffered. War is romantic from far away, but up close, it is hunger. Fields destroyed, families displaced, winter approaching with empty food stores. Many Scots began to question everything. Was resistance worth the cost? Freedom sounds powerful, but survival feels urgent, and desperation makes people dangerous. Some Scottish nobles quietly contacted England. They wanted peace, safety, their lands protected. They were tired of hiding, tired of uncertainty, tired of Wallace. Because rebels inspire hope, but they also attract war, and war destroys everything. Edward understood this perfectly. He did not need to defeat Wallace in battle. He only needed to make Scotland abandon him. So he changed strategy. Instead of hunting Wallace directly, he hunted his allies. Anyone suspected of helping rebels was punished. Anyone offering shelter risked execution. Trust became dangerous. Friendship became suspicious. Loyalty became deadly. Slowly, Wallace's world shrank. Fewer safe houses, fewer messengers, fewer allies willing to risk everything. He was becoming isolated, and isolation is the first step toward capture. But Wallace refused to surrender. He continued the attacks, the raids, the disappearances. Each strike reminded England of one truth. The rebellion was not dead. It was waiting, watching, breathing in the dark. Years passed in this brutal stalemate. No decisive battles, no final victory, only tension. And tension cannot last forever. Eventually, someone always breaks. And the man who could not be defeated in battle was about to be betrayed by his own people. War changes people, but prolonged war changes something deeper. It changes what people are willing to accept. After years of raids, executions, hunger, and uncertainty, Scotland was no longer unified. It was exhausted, and exhaustion creates a dangerous desire. Peace at any cost. William Wallace was still alive, still moving, still resisting, but the world around him had shifted. The English crown had not given up. King Edward I had changed tactics completely. No more massive campaigns, no more expensive invasions. Now the weapon was information, gold, promises, bribes, because men are easier to break than armies. Edward's agents spread across Scotland quietly. They did not arrive with swords. They arrived with offers, lands restored, titles returned, safety jeep, guarantee. All they had to do was speak. All they had to do was point. All they had to do was betray one man. And slowly, it began to work. Scottish nobles who once supported resistance started to distance themselves. Not openly, not loudly, quietly. They stopped protecting Wallace's messengers, stopped offering shelter, stopped asking questions they no longer wanted answered. Because loyalty is expensive, and fear is contagious. Wallace understood what was happening. He was being erased without a battle, not by swords, but by silence. People who once called him hero now avoided his name, because being associated with him had become dangerous. England tightened its net. Roads were watched, ports monitored, villages interrogated. The bounty on Wallace increased again. Gold has a language everyone understands, and in a starving country, that language becomes irresistible. Then came the final betrayal. A man named Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish knight, a noble, a man who had once sworn loyalty to his own people. But loyalty does not survive long under pressure. He made a decision, not for ideology, not for England, but for survival and reward. Wallace was hiding near Glasgow, exhausted, constantly moving, trusting fewer and fewer people. The network protecting him had almost completely collapsed, and Menteith knew exactly where to look, because betrayal always comes from proximity. The night was quiet when they arrived. No warning, no battle, no heroic last stand, just men surrounding a building in silence. Inside, William Wallace slept. The man who had shaken an empire was now human again, vulnerable, tired, unaware. They broke in, fast, violent, final. There was no fight worth recording, no duel, no speech, only overwhelming force. And then silence. Wallace was captured, not by England, but by Scotland. That was the final cruelty. The rebellion that had united a nation was undone by that same nation. He was taken in chains, bound in iron, dragged toward English territory under heavy guard. No rescue came, no uprising followed, because fear had already done its work. England did not rush. They did not need to. They had him. And now, they would make sure everyone knew it. The journey to London had begun. William Wallace was no longer a free man. He was no longer a commander, no longer a symbol of resistance moving through forests and shadows. He was a prisoner. But the English crown did not treat him like an ordinary prisoner. They treated him like an object of state importance, something to be displayed, something to be shown, something to be broken slowly in the minds of everyone who saw him. Heavy iron chains locked around his wrists and ankles. Not rope, not leather, iron. Because rope can be cut, leather can wear, Iron only obeys force. Every movement of his body produced sound, metal against metal, chains dragging against saddle and armor. He was mounted and surrounded by armed soldiers at all times, not to prevent escape, but to prevent rescue. The journey south to London was long, cold, wet, unforgiving. Days stretched into weeks. England wanted Scotland to watch what happened to its hero, but they also wanted England itself to see it. Fear had to travel. Villages along the road were ordered to gather. People were forced to line the paths, not as spectators by choice, but by expectation. Soldiers ensured silence broke when it needed to, shouting, insults, stones. The message was simple. This is what happens to rebellion. Wallace said almost nothing during the journey, not because he had nothing to say, but because words no longer mattered in the way they once did. His war was no longer being fought on battlefields. It was being fought inside minds, and minds were already shifting. Some people shouted hatred at him. Others stayed silent. A few looked away completely, because seeing him like this created discomfort. He was no longer the unstoppable figure of legend. He was a man in chains, and that made the truth harder to hold on to. The English soldiers watched carefully for signs of weakness. They expected collapse. They expected begging. They expected the myth to die before London. But Wallace did not give them what they wanted. He endured, quietly, physically broken, mentally unshattered. And that made him more dangerous than ever. Because execution is not only about death, it is about narrative. If a man breaks before death, the story becomes simple. He was weak. But if he does not break, the story becomes something else, something harder to control. As they approached London, the roads grew more crowded. The Crown had prepared for this moment for years. Messengers had already spread warnings. Priests had already delivered sermons. Stories had already been planted. Wallace was not a man in English eyes. He was a monster, a warning given flesh. By the time the procession reached the city, the crowd was no longer neutral. It was conditioned. Anger, fear, hatred, curiosity, all mixed together into something unstable. Thousands lined the streets, not to witness justice, to witness punishment. The gates of London opened. The city that represented order, law, and empire prepared to receive the man it called its greatest enemy. And Wallace crossed the threshold into the capital alive, which was intentional, because death was not the goal yet, not until the message had been fully delivered. He was taken toward the Tower of London, stone walls, controlled access, a fortress designed not just to hold prisoners, but to erase them from the outside world. Inside it, a man could disappear. Outside it, only the Crown controlled the story. But Wallace would not remain hidden for long. King Edward I had ordered something very specific. There would be no quiet end, no private execution, no mercy of obscurity. What was coming next was designed for maximum visibility, maximum terror, maximum memory. Because now the war had changed again. It was no longer Scotland versus England. It was one man versus an empire. And the empire was preparing the final lesson. London did not treat William Wallace as a prisoner. It treated him as an event that had finally arrived. The entire political machine of the English crown had been preparing for this moment for years, even before his capture. Every rumor, every sermon, every royal proclamation had already shaped public expectation. Wallace was not coming to be judged, he was coming to be used. Inside the Tower of London, time changed shape. Days no longer followed normal rhythm. There was no sense of distance from the outside world, only guarded silence, stone corridors, and the constant presence of armed men. Wallace was kept alive deliberately, not for mercy, for control, because a dead man cannot be shaped into a message. The English crown understood something most rulers ignore. Fear does not come from violence alone. It comes from timing. If violence is immediate, it is just brutality. If violence is delayed, anticipated, structured, it becomes psychological domination. And Wallace was now inside that structure. Outside the tower, London prepared itself. The city was already primed. For years, official narratives had circulated through churches and public spaces. Wallace had been described not as a man, but as a category of threat. Traitor, rebel, enemy of God's order. By the time he arrived, most citizens did not expect to meet a human being. They expected a symbol. Inside the royal court, decisions were being finalized. King Edward I was no longer thinking in terms of battlefield victory. He was thinking in terms of historical imprint. How do you make an example last longer than the man himself? How do you ensure obedience continues after death? The answer was structure, not execution, deconstruction. Legal preparation began under strict control. Charges were be assembled not just to convict, but to justify total erasure. Treason was the centerpiece. Because in medieval law, treason was not just a crime against a king. It was a crime against the order of reality itself. But there was a complication. Wallace had never formally submitted to Edward's authority. He had never sworn loyalty, never signed oaths of fealty, never accepted English rule as legitimate, which created a paradox. How do you betray a ruler you never served? Inside Westminster legal reasoning, this was not a flaw. It was an obstacle to be overwritten. Law in this context was not neutral. It was adaptive. Its purpose was not truth. Its purpose was conclusion. On the day of the trial, Wallace was brought from the Tower into Westminster Hall. The space was enormous. Stone, wood, height designed to reduce individuals into insignificance. Judges sat elevated above him. The architecture itself communicated hierarchy. Authority above, subject below. The hall was filled. Nobles, officials, clergy, guards, witnesses. Not all of them agreed on what they were about to see, but all of them understood it would be remembered, because the crown had ensured it would be remembered. Wallace stood alone at the center, chains still on his body. But something else was also present. Attention. And attention is a form of power, even in captivity. The charges were read: sedition, murder, destruction of royal authority, treason. Each accusation stacked carefully, building a legal architecture meant to end in a single conclusion: guilty. But then something unexpected happened. Wallace spoke. Not to beg, not to plead, to challenge the foundation of the accusation itself. He argued that he could not be a traitor because he had never sworn allegiance to Edward. No oath, no contract, no legal bond of feudal submission. In medieval logic, loyalty is transactional. Without agreement, there is no betrayal. The courtroom shifted because this was not emotional defiance. It was structural contradiction. And structural contradictions are dangerous in systems built on absolute authority. But the Crown did not respond with debate. It responded with closure. The legal outcome had already been determined. The trial was not a search for truth. It was a formalized confirmation of punishment. The verdict was read. Guilty, treason confirmed, sentence prepared, and now the final phase would begin. Not immediately, because Edward I had one final requirement. The execution must be seen, completely, publicly, unavoidably. Outside Westminster Hall, the city was already waiting. Smithfield would become the stage. And what would happen there would not be hidden in history. It would be carved into it. Because now the purpose was no longer to remove William Wallace from the world. It was to redefine what the world believed was possible to do to a human being. And that lesson was about to begin. Smithfield Market was never meant to be sacred. It was not a place of kings or crowns or ceremony. It was a place of commerce, of animals, of trade, of blood in the simplest form. And that is exactly why the Crown chose it. On the morning of the execution, London felt different. Not louder, not more chaotic, heavier. As if the entire city understood it was about to witness something it could not unsee. People gathered early, before the sun fully rose. before the streets filled completely. They wanted position. They wanted sight. They wanted to say later that they had seen it with their own eyes. William Wallace was brought from Westminster under heavy guard. He was not carried in secrecy. He was displayed. The procession moved slowly through the city. Every street it passed became part of the performance, and every witness became part of the message. The crown had learned something important about power. Fear does not spread evenly. It spreads through observation. One person sees, then tells another. Then that person believes, and belief multiplies faster than law. By the time they reached Smithfield, the square was full. Soldiers formed a perimeter, not to protect the prisoner, to protect the ritual. Because this was not spontaneous violence, it was controlled administration. Wallace was removed from his restraints just enough to be displayed. His body was not allowed dignity. It was positioned, arranged, made visible. Every detail of the setup was intentional. Nothing was accidental. The first stage was degradation, stripping of clothing, exposure, the removal of any remaining distance between the man and the crowd. A king did not want him hidden. A king wanted him seen as ordinary. The crowd reacted in waves, shouting, spitting, stones, insults. Not all of it was personal hatred. Much of it was performance, because crowds become what authority expects them to become. Then the execution began, not as a single act, but as a sequence, a controlled progression, each step designed to escalate psychological impact. First came the hanging, not a clean drop, a controlled strangulation, long enough to force the body into struggle, short enough to keep him alive. The objective was not death. The objective was proximity to death. The body convulsed, air disappeared, time stretched. The crowd watched a man caught between states, not alive in any normal sense, not yet gone. Then he was revived, deliberately, because collapse alone was not enough. The crown wanted awareness, consciousness, memory forming in real time. The second phase began immediately. Dismemberment, systematic, structured, controlled. Not chaotic violence, procedural destruction. Each act was performed in public view, each action witnessed, each witness becoming a carrier of the story. Because terror does not end when violence ends, it continues in retelling. Parts of the body were separated, handled, displayed, not discarded. This was not disposal. This was communication. The message was not subtle. Resistance would not be defeated. It would be dismantled, piece by piece, until nothing recognizable remained. And still, the crowd did not disperse, because horror creates attention loops. People cannot look away from something that exceeds expectation. When it was finally over, there was no silence of relief, only absorption. The moment was already becoming history in the minds of those present, before it had even ended. And that was the point. Edward I did not want an execution. He wanted an imprint, something that would outlive witnesses, something that would travel further than any army. William Wallace was gone, but what remained was not absence, it was narrative. And narratives do not stay buried, they spread. After Smithfield, London did not return to normal immediately. There is no clean transition after something like that. The city continued to move. Merchants reopened stalls. Church bells rang. People returned to their routines. But something had changed in the way they remembered the world. William Wallace was no longer a man in public memory. He had been transformed, not into a hero, not into a villain, into a lesson. A fixed point in history meant to warn, not inspire. The English crown understood something very clearly. Violence alone is temporary, but symbolism lasts longer than bodies. So they extended the execution beyond the moment of death. They turned it into geography. Parts of Wallace's body were sent across the kingdom, not hidden, not buried, displayed. Each location became a node in a network of warning, a map of consequence. Travelers passing through northern towns would see reminders, not just of rebellion, but of what rebellion becomes when it fails. The message was simple and consistent. There is no distance from the crown. In Scotland, the reaction was not the one Edward expected. There was fear, there was silence, there was shock. But there was something else growing underneath it. Something quieter, more stable. Anger that did not immediately burn out. Because fear has a limit. At first it controls behavior, then it controls speech, then it controls memory. But eventually, it reaches resistance. Not loud resistance, enduring resistance. The nobles who had once tried to balance survival with submission began to reassess everything. Because Wallace's death proved something they could no longer ignore. Cooperation did not guarantee safety. Submission did not guarantee survival. England had not rewarded loyalty with stability. It had rewarded it with vulnerability. And that realization slowly changed the political landscape. In the years after Wallace's death, something unexpected began to form. Not immediately, not openly, but inevitably. A new Scottish resistance. Different in structure, different in leadership, different in strategy, but built on the same foundation: memory. William Wallace did not leave behind an army. He left behind a precedent, a proof that England could be fought, and that proof could not be erased. Edward I believed he had ended the rebellion, but he had actually done something more dangerous. He had removed its leader and turned him into a symbol. Symbols are more efficient than commanders. Commanders can be killed. Symbols survive through repetition, through stories, through fear, through time. In Scotland, those stories changed shape as they were told. Wallace became larger in memory than he ever was in life. Not because people exaggerated for entertainment, but because memory simplifies trauma into meaning. And meaning is what builds future resistance. Edward I continued ruling for only a short time after Wallace's execution. His focus remained on control, on suppression, on ensuring that what happened at Smithfield would never be repeated. But history does not obey intention. It obeys consequence. The final irony of his campaign was not immediate. It came later, after his death, when Scotland rose again, not under Wallace, but under others who had learned from him. Because in the end, the crown achieved something irreversible. It destroyed a man, but it created a memory that would outlast the empire that tried to erase him. And that is how William Wallace stopped being a person and became a warning that turned into a legend, that turned into a nation's memory of resistance. King Edward I of England believed he had solved the problem, not just defeated it, solved it. In his mind, William Wallace was finished, removed from politics, removed from war, removed from history. But empires are always wrong about one thing. They confuse silence with obedience. After Wallace's death, Scotland did not immediately rise. There was no instant revolution, no sudden united uprising. Instead, there was fragmentation, fear, uncertainty, political collapse. England had achieved control on paper, but not in reality. The Scottish resistance did not disappear. It changed form. Smaller groups, local leaders, disconnected pockets of defiance. Not an army anymore. An idea surviving inside people. And ideas do not need supply lines. They do not need castles. They do not need permission. They only need memory. William Wallace became memory. Not the polished version created by propaganda, but the version spoken in quiet spaces, in barns, in fields, in fires lit after dark. A man who refused to kneel. England tried to control that memory, through officials, through church messaging, through fear. But memory does not obey authority. It spreads through repetition, not permission. Years passed. The war continued in different forms. Skirmishes, rebellions, shifting alliances. Nothing stable, nothing final. Then a new figure emerged. Robert the Bruce, a nobleman watching the same collapse Wallace had seen, but with different timing, different strategy, different opportunity. He studied what had happened, and he understood something critical. Wallace had shown that England could be resisted, But he had also shown what happened when resistance was uncoordinated. Bruce rebuilt the resistance carefully, not as scattered rebellion, but as structured war. He united fractured groups. He rebuilt leadership. He turned chaos into organization. And slowly, the balance shifted again. Not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily, like pressure building under stone. England, exhausted by years of occupation, began to lose control of territory it once held firmly. Garrisons became isolated, supply lines weakened, local resistance returned. The system Edward built began to strain. Edward I himself never saw the final outcome. In 1307, he died near the border of Scotland, not in battle, not in victory, but in illness. His body failed while the war he started remained unresolved. After his death, English authority weakened, not collapsed instantly, but lost its absolute grip, and Scotland seized the opportunity. At the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, under Robert the Bruce, Scotland achieved decisive victory against England. It was not just military success, it was political reversal. The war Edward tried to end ended without him. But even then, William Wallace was not forgotten, because his story had already moved beyond the battlefield, beyond politics, beyond the men who tried to define it. He was no longer part of strategy, he was part of identity, a reference point for resistance, a memory that could be reshaped but not erased. Edward I tried to make an example, to create fear that would last longer than rebellion. But he misunderstood something fundamental. Fear fades when people stop believing in it. Memory does not. William Wallace died on a table in London. But what died with him was not rebellion. What died was the illusion that empire is permanent. And what survived was the idea that even the most powerful system in the world can be challenged by someone it refuses to take seriously. That is why his story continued. Not because of how he died, but because of what his death proved. Empires do not fall when they are attacked. They fall when the idea holding them together stops working. And once that happens, no execution is enough to save them.